Welcome to the fifth and final part of my series on the neutral powers of World War II. Today we're going to take a look at Sweden and examine the role that the Swedish played in affecting the course and outcome of World War II. Before we look at what Sweden did during the war itself, I'd like to take a look at the political landscape of the country prior to the outbreak of the war. From the late 19th century until about 1931, Sweden was constantly beset by labor disputes, social unrest, and calls for political reform. In 1931, the Adelan shootings occurred when one of the major labor strikes became bloody when the military was called in to reinforce the police, and the military ended up firing on the protesters and killing 5 people. In addition, this was a period where many in leadership were becoming worried about the right-wing militia groups which were forming and which bore a resemblance to the fascist groups throughout the rest of Europe. In 1932, Per Albin Hansson of the Social Democrats was elected as prime minister, and he would serve more or less uninterrupted until his death in 1946, meaning that he would be in charge of Sweden throughout the entirety of the war. The Social Democrats strove to cooperate and compromise with the other groups on the left, but they also had no interest in working with the pro-Soviet groups on the left because they thought that these groups were disloyal to Sweden. On September 1st, 1939, when the Germans famously invaded Poland, Hansson declared Sweden neutral in the conflict, which would later go on to be known as World War II. Despite sticking to his country's long-standing commitment to neutrality, Hansson did see the necessity of rearmament if Sweden were to deter aggression from its increasingly aggressive and dangerous neighbors. In 1936, rearmament began. Now, in 1936, the Swedish government only allocated $37 million to spending on the military. But then in 1937, that number jumped to $50 million, and it went up the next year to $58.6 million. And then in 1939, it skyrocketed all the way to $322.3 million. We also see other measures being taken. In 1938, there began a mandatory training period for boys age 15 in case they were conscripted. And in 1924, there was a corps called the Loterna, which was founded, and these are volunteer women who are to care for the wounded, so basically volunteer nurses. At the same time, Sweden also placed an order for 300 aircraft to defend its airspace from the United States, but the U.S. was only able to deliver 60 of these aircraft by 1940, when Sweden would be cut off from any further deliveries. The Swedes had every intention of remaining neutral in World War II. However, they possessed the richest iron ore in Europe, and that made them a target for both sides. Just to give you an idea of how pure this ore is, the ore in Sweden is about 66% pure, as opposed to the ore in Lorraine, which is only about 33% pure, and that means it's much easier to process. And the Germans are the most dependent upon this ore, so for them, this is one of the lifelines of their war industry. And naturally, the Allies are aware of this, so one of the things that they try to do is to figure out ways to stop the flow of that ore from Sweden to Germany. And one of their plans is essentially to occupy the Norwegian and Swedish ports which export this ore. And the Allies originally had wanted to try to use the Winter War of 1939 as a cover, the Winter War, of course, being the Soviet invasion of Finland. Let's do a quick tangent on the Winter War. So while that was going on, the Swedish public was highly sympathetic to the Finns, and 8,000 Swedes volunteered to serve in Finland. In addition, the Swedish government sent over medical aid, military supplies, weapons, all kinds of things to Finland, and they also accepted 70,000 children as refugees in Sweden. Back to the Allied plan to cut off Swedish ore. So, another Allied plan was to mine the Norwegian waters near the ports. That way the shipping, the cargo ships couldn't get out and get to Germany. So Hitler became aware of these plans, and he decided to prioritize an invasion of Scandinavia, since he knew that especially Churchill had no intention of allowing that ore to keep going to Germany. So he decided to invade Norway on April 9th, 1940, and this this secured the German ore supply. By the spring and summer of 1940, Sweden was surrounded on all sides by German occupation forces and German allies. Obviously, there were German occupation forces in Denmark and Norway, and because of the Soviet threat, the Finns had decided to align themselves with the Axis powers in order to gain some sort of security against a future Soviet invasion. Now, King Gustav was able to negotiate with Hitler and get him to respect Swedish neutrality, but of course, predictably, the main concern that Hitler had was that Sweden would continue to export iron ore to Germany, and they were willing to make that compromise. It was better than being occupied by the Nazis. However, one of the negative parts of this agreement for the Swedish people is that now they're completely dependent on the Germans for foreign trade, and this means that this northern power is cut off from 70% of their energy supply and a large number of the foodstuffs that they were accustomed to importing. So this is not great if you were living in Sweden at the time. Now, the Germans would make some very limited concessions to the Swedes. They were allowed to have 5 non-Axis ships in port each month to bring things that they couldn't get elsewhere, and they would use these ships to bring in things like oil, textiles, wheat, and raw film. But of course, there were shortages in all of these things, and those 5 meager ships were by no means able to keep Sweden fully supplied with the things that they wanted in the war. Here's what Europe looked like in 1942, and look at it from the perspective of Sweden. To your west, Norway is occupied by the Germans. Your southwest, Denmark, occupied by the Germans. Due south, Germany itself. Southeast, the German-occupied Baltic. And to your immediate east, you have Finland, which is now aligned with Germany. So if you're Sweden, you have very few options, and you have to tread lightly and carefully, otherwise you will be added to the list of occupied powers. So this is mainly why Sweden was willing to keep exporting ore to the Germans during the war. Their only other alternative was to be occupied by the Nazis. That didn't turn out well for anyone who experienced that, so Sweden probably acted in its own best interest by remaining neutral during the conflict. It was really the only rational decision that they could make given the circumstances. In addition to its iron ore, another product of Sweden which was highly sought after was the ball bearing. Sven Wingquist had invented the ball bearing and founded a company called SKF to produce them not long before the war. During the course of the war, SKF produced and shipped out hundreds of thousands of ball bearings. To make these ball bearings, you needed steel, so this necessitated the importation of some coal and coke from Britain in order to make the steel to then make the ball bearings. Now, because of the trade agreements that Sweden had been forced to make to be allowed to maintain its neutrality and independence, they had to ship these openly to Germany, but quite a number of these ball bearings were also smuggled to Britain during the war. Due to the severe constraints on Sweden's ability to import and export goods, their economy during the war suffered greatly. The unemployment rate was sky high. Prices rose by 40%, while real wages actually declined by 10 to 12%. Taxes doubled, which, that combined with real wages being down and unemployment being up, not great. There was almost no new housing built during the course of the war. And because they only had one trade partner that they could openly trade with without getting invaded, their iron exports by 1942 had fallen to 2/3 of what they had been before the war. So, all in all, this is going very poorly for them from an economic standpoint. The Swedish people suffered from many shortages during World War II due to the lack of imports from outside powers. And this was further compounded by 2 consecutive bad wheat harvests in 1940 and 1941. So, to try to make up for the shortages that they were experiencing, they had to find and make other products. So, for their transportation needs, the fuel shortage led a lot of people to make increased use of their bikes. And that was one way to get around that. For everything else, they tended to turn to the forest, because Sweden had fairly abundant forests at this time, and they were able to try to make good all of their shortages by going into the woods and finding various types of wood which could be made into products that they could use for their daily lives. So without sugar, they couldn't make schnapps, so what they did is they found a way to make wood sugar, and they distilled that into something which kind of tasted like schnapps. They also fed their cows wood pulp as fodder, and that was sufficient to keep the cattle alive, so that was another example. And without coffee, which also came from warmer climate regions, they were able to make something out of wood shavings, beets, and acorns, which was something like a coffee substitute. It doesn't sound very good to me, but I guess it's better than nothing. During World War II, pretty much every country that was even marginally involved in the war or a neutral power on the border of a warring power had fairly strict censorship. Sweden kind of goes along with that, but doesn't maybe do it as strictly as most countries. So, for the most part, censorship in Sweden was more or less limited to protecting military secrets. One sort of exception to that, however, is that Sweden continued its policies of trying to suppress Nazi and communist groups within the country, so Nazi and communist publications were silenced, and that was largely to prevent the publication of opinions which would call for Sweden to enter the war on one side or another, since a Nazi publication would presumably want the Swedes to join up with the Germans, and a communist publication would say that they needed to stand in solidarity with their brothers in the Soviet Union. Here is the N. Sphinx tiger. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I'm probably not. Somebody will let me know in the comments, I'm sure. And this tiger was a symbol to remind citizens to be wary of spies. Other countries had similar symbols and imagery to remind citizens to be leery. And despite the fact that they tried to suppress the strongest opinions which would be out there from the Nazis and the communists, the public was still largely able to express their sentiments about most issues, including the fact that they didn't approve of the Nazis. And, predictably, the Nazis were not happy about that. They didn't like criticism. They were kind of the snowflakes in the 1940s, ironically. Anyway, Sweden, that is how they handled their press at the time. Let's take a look at the Swedish Army and how it evolved over the course of the war. So from 1890 until 1942, Sweden's army was divided into 4 divisions. In 1939, there were 130,000 total men, but they were well trained and the officers were of excellent quality. In 1939, when war broke out in Europe, Sweden only had 64 tanks and 30 armored cars. In 1940, as war began to look likely and Norway was occupied, Sweden formed a home guard, which was designed to provide reserves for that professional standing army that they already had. AB Landsverk is the main tank manufacturer in Sweden at this time, and the designs of tanks that they were producing after 1940 improved dramatically as they looked around at what the Germans and others had, and they realized that what they had been fielding before that was inadequate. In 1942, the Swedish Army was reorganized and more divisions were added. The Army eventually would double up to 250,000 men, and the number of armored units available would increase by 3. Let's take a look at Sweden's Air Force during the war. In 1939, Sweden had 195 planes of varying modernity, and the dominant type of plane that they would field was the torpedo bomber, and this is because torpedo bombers are useful for taking out ships, since the Swedes saw that the primary threat to them would be by sea, since it's kind of hard to invade overland from Norway or Finland. The best design that they produced during the war was probably the Saab B-17 dive bomber, and essentially this was simply a better Stuka. It was more agile and it could carry more payload, but of course it never really saw combat because it was the aircraft of a neutral power. However, had it seen combat, it would have been a beast. In 1943, Sweden started fielding the J-22 fighter, and this is one which had the agility to hold its own at low altitudes with the P-51 Mustang. So while the Swedish aircraft ultimately never really achieved fame since they never saw combat, they were completely capable of being very effective combat aircraft. When One thing that Sweden produced during the war, which was quite remarkable in terms of its reputation, was the Bofors 40mm anti-aircraft guns, and these featured advanced auto-loading, which was a new feature at the time, and they were pretty accurate. This design would be used by the British and Americans, and it was their standard anti-aircraft gun. During the course of the war, Sweden supplemented its native production models of aircraft with Italian and then in the later phases of the war, American designs. And by 1945, Sweden had amassed an air force with 593 fighters and 879 bombers. Let's take a look at the Swedish Navy. Now, the Swedish Navy was primarily geared to defend the shoals of the Baltic rather than to try to contest larger fleets in the open waters of the North Sea or the Atlantic. The Swedish Navy possessed 15 shallow water submarines, and they also had 15 fast destroyers which could do 42 knots. A destroyer that could do 42 knots was world class at this time. So these destroyers would be, considered state of the art, and they were just as good as pretty much anything you would find in any other navy. Sweden also had a pocket battleship which had 15-inch guns that aren't much less powerful than the ones we see on the large American battleships, but it only had 1/5 of the tonnage of an American battleship, so it was meant to dole out punishment, but it could not take the kind of hits that an American battleship could sustain. In addition to the Finnish refugees that the Swedes had allowed to come into their country after the Winter War of 1939, the Swedes also took in quite a large number of Norwegians when they fled from Norway following the German occupation in 1940. And the Swedes armed and trained about 12,500 Norwegians, and this force was designed to reestablish order after the end of the German occupation. Now, the Germans heard rumors about this, but the Swedes were able to successfully lie and say that these camps were for managing difficult young men, when in reality they were for training these young men to fight. And during the course of the war, about 2,000 Norwegians were able to leave their refuge in Sweden and then serve with the British, which was a violation of Swedish neutrality. However, the Swedes didn't get caught, so I guess it was fine. Let's look at how Finland conducted its foreign affairs up to 1942. So, as I mentioned earlier, during the Winter War of 1939, 70,000 Finnish war orphans had come in, and during the war, Sweden kept those war orphans and raised them and cared for them. They also took in a large number of refugees relative to their population, about 200,000 total, and not surprisingly, most of them were fellow Scandinavians who had fled over the border. For the most part, Sweden tried to tailor its neutrality to favor the Allies, but they had to do so within reason since the Germans surrounded them on all sides and were the biggest immediate threat. One thing that Sweden had to do that the Allies would later chastise them for was allowing German forces to move by Swedish rails. And by the summer of 1943, the Swedes had allowed 2.2 million men and 100,000 rail cars to move through Swedish territory using Swedish rails. Now, for the most part, the British, surprisingly, given that the British were led by Churchill, who normally had no tolerance whatsoever for neutrals, the British were actually pretty tolerant of Swedish neutrality. They understood the situation, and they probably appreciated the fact that the Swedes did try to smuggle ball bearings to Britain and do a few other things. But the Americans, who were generally tolerant of neutrality, were impatient with Sweden, and they kept urging the Swedes to take a more aggressive stance and do more to favor the Allies. Like other neutral powers that we've studied, the Swedes started to shift away from the Germans and towards the Allies as the fortunes of war started to favor the Allies more. In 1942, German power and prestige was becoming undermined as it suffered major defeats. So in the east, they suffered the great defeat at Stalingrad, where the 6th Army was destroyed, and in North Africa, a German and Italian army was forced to surrender to the Allies. So it was clear that the momentum in the war was shifting. At the same time, Sweden was growing stronger militarily. So that meant that if Hitler wanted to launch a subsidiary operation to conquer Sweden, he'd have to really launch a major diversion, and that would weaken him in key points. So it's not something that he was likely to do. And this meant that the Swedes could now take bolder stances than they had taken in the past. In the summer of 1943, they took probably their biggest single risk when they declared that the Germans were no longer allowed to move through Sweden. So earlier I mentioned that the Germans had moved millions of men and tons of supplies through Sweden during the war. But in August 1943, the Swedes said, you're not allowed to do that anymore. The Germans retaliated by sinking trawlers and shooting down a courier plane, but ultimately the Swedes were not provoked enough to go to war with them over it. In the fall of 1943, the Swedes sent in a special rescue fleet, and they rescued 7,200 Danish Jews who were about to be rounded up and sent to concentration camps. And the Swedes also began to send weapons and ammunition to the Danish resistance. That was their way of retaliating when the Germans sank their ships and shot down their plane. This is also the time when they violated neutrality and allowed 2,000 Norwegians to go serve with the British. In late 1944, as it was clear that Germany was losing the war and that the end was nigh, Sweden cut off all trade with Germany and stopped sending them iron ore. In the spring of 1945, Count Bernadotte actually rescued POWs and Jews, and that was pretty much what Sweden did during the war. I guess it's not quite as exciting as what a lot of other countries did, but I do like that they had a rescue fleet at one point, and that they eventually did cut off all trade with Germany. While the choice not to fight the Nazis is always controversial and always occasions comments about how these people must have been cowards, the fact is that neutrality was the right choice for Sweden, and it was successful. It enabled Sweden to avoid a Nazi occupation, which no one would have liked, aid the Allies, and rescue refugees from all of its neighboring countries. Sweden would follow up this policy by maintaining armed neutrality during the Cold War, and would also maintain this tradition of producing their own arms and weapon systems. The latest product of Sweden that I'm aware of in that regard is the Saab Gripen fighter, which is the equal of other designs like the Joint Strike Fighter and the Rafale and the Eurofighter Typhoon and all of those kind of things. Now, Sweden's neutrality officially ended in 1995 when Sweden joined the EU, and presumably if there's another major war in Europe that involves the EU, then Sweden will be brought into that conflict. Whenever that occurs, if it occurs, then Sweden's history of staying out of war since 1814 will come to an end. But as it stands in late 2017, Sweden has not fought a war since 1814, so it's been 203 years at this point.